Just getting the screen set up.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to the fifth of our speakers today. Katie Schneider is a human wildlife conflict specialist and has a bachelor's degree in conservation biology from Colorado State University. She leads the Colorado Wolf Restoration and Coexistence Program for Defenders of Wildlife. And that program is aimed at ensuring that wolves, livestock, and people in Colorado can thrive on a shared landscape. She also leads a statewide interorganizational education and outreach effort to gain support for the reintroduction of wolverines to Colorado. These are two species, the wolves and wolverines, that we are watching closely, as we are the condor, for parallels in the lessons learned and the steps that we need to take. And so we're really looking forward to hearing what Katie has to say today about human wildlife conflicts with these two species. Katie, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, I'm so excited to chat with you guys today. Yesterday was actually the official start of Wolf Awareness Week for the year. So what a good way to celebrate. Let me just pull up my slides here. All right, can you see that okay?
Yes.
There
Perfect.
you go. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you. So again, today I'm joining you from just north of Denver, Colorado. I live about an hour north of the city. I live on the ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute people. We also recognize the 48 contemporary tribal nations that are historically tied to the lands that now make up the state of Colorado. Defenders of Wildlife acknowledges the indigenous peoples are the original stewards of the lands, water, and wildlife of North America, and we seek to honor and recognize the ties that these nations still have to their homelands. We have a lot of ground to cover today. Colorado is actually the first state to try to reintroduce a species, an imperiled species, via direct democracy or a ballot initiative. So there's a lot of unique kind of features that go into the wolf reintroduction. So I'm going to kind of outline kind of the steps that kind of led us to that moment, why we went about it that way. I'm going to talk about kind of the status of the reintroduction so far this year, what Defenders is doing, kind of my role in the reintroduction, and some recommendations that I would have for professionals working on different types of reintroduction efforts or restoration efforts for other species around the country. And just a little bit more about myself. I've been at Defenders for about 3 years now. Before that, I worked for local, state, and federal agencies to help increase this kind of coexistence or reduce human wildlife conflict with endangered species. I've done this around the world with Asian elephants, you'll see there in the top. I worked a little bit on sea turtles down in Mexico for a little while, and more recently black-footed ferrets and their prey, prairie dogs, here on the Great Plains. And my job now largely revolves around helping livestock producers minimize wolf livestock conflict. And so sometimes this looks like pounding posts in the field, or kind of organizing more of the community outreach and engagement types of efforts, or advocating to our legislature, to the commission. So my day-to-day work life looks pretty different, but I could not imagine a more rewarding way to use my degree. And I highly encourage anyone who's kind of interested in that social aspect of conservation to really consider human wildlife conflict, because it is a very fun job and it keeps me on my toes. If you've never heard of Defenders of Wildlife before, we are a national wildlife conservation nonprofit organization. We work on the ground, in the courts, and on the Hill to help restore imperiled native species in the habitats they depend on. I'm part of our Rockies and Plains field conservation team. So my team works from Colorado to Montana on critters like wolves, but also grizzly bears, black-footed ferrets, bison, swift fox, beavers, all sorts of fun critters. And I want to preface a lot of what I'm going to talk about today by saying that Defenders really has been leading the charge for decades in wolf recovery. We've been working on wolf restoration in the lower 48 longer than I have been alive, since 1987. We were actually we were the first organization or entity to create a wolf compensation depredation program. And so this ran for 23 years. We distributed over $1.4 million to ranchers who experienced losses due to wolves. And as that, we essentially created a model for the states to adopt. And as that role transitioned to the state, we focused on shifting more towards that on the ground field kind of coexistence component. So helping prevent these conflicts from happening in the first place before they resulted in loss of livestock or wolves. I am one of 5 field staff around the country that work on wolf restoration. I have one in Colorado, one in Montana, one in Oregon, one in the Southwest, and one in the Southeast. In Colorado, we've been working for the past 5 years or so actually on the ground. We have had a couple wolves that have come down on their own, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So we've been helping fund a lot of these on the ground projects, funding range riders who are individuals typically on horseback that help monitor livestock and carnivores to mitigate conflicts or haze away carnivores away from livestock, and in other tools on the ground, as well as kind of workshops and training opportunities for producers to feel a little bit more comfortable with these different strategies. On wolves themselves, they live around 6 to 8 years in the wild, and like other animals, they can live a little bit longer in captivity. They have a early mating season, so they'll have their litters in around May. June is when we kind of start to see them pop out of the den. Their litters generally have 4 to 7 pups. They live, travel, and hunt in social packs of 2 to 12. And I think there's a lot of really convoluted explanations of what makes up a wolf pack. It's really just, a breeding pair and their offspring, so not very unlike human families. Wolves also live in a really wide variety of habitat types. So historically, we've found wolves from the deserts to the plains to the high alpine to even the coast. And so we call these habitat generalists. And so they can live in this wide variety of habitats as opposed to like a black-footed ferret that needs a really specific prey, a really specific type of habitat or environment, which really means that wolves can recover biologically if socially we just kind of give them the time and space to do so. Wolves are also what we know as neophobic, which means that they're generally afraid of new things, and they're generally wary of people. And this is actually a lot of the solutions that we have to wolf livestock conflict depend on this trait. So we use bright lights and funny sounds to try to spook wolves away from certain areas. This also means that eventually they will usually try to test those things. And so we kind of have to keep rotating different tips and tricks to keep those things new and novel so that they continue to be deterred away from any certain area. Wolves are federally in most of the lower 48 states. They are delisted in the northern Rockies, so Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and the eastern kind of portion of Washington and Oregon, but endangered in the rest of the country and threatened in Minnesota. So they are federally endangered in Colorado. And they are native here. They were extirpated regionally in about the 40s due to predator poisoning efforts, like ones that swept most of the West. In last December, Colorado Parks and Wildlife reintroduced 10 wolves from Oregon, and we have another 15 wolves from British Columbia coming this winter. And this is a really big deal for a handful of reasons. So Colorado has long been considered some of the best unoccupied wolf habitat left in the lower 48. In particular, the western slope of Colorado, which has really abundant populations of their native prey. In Colorado, that primary prey is elk. We have about 280,000 elk, which is the biggest state population. That is more elk than Idaho and Montana combined, to give you a little bit of perspective, and those states can support thousands of wolves. But wolves will also prey on other ungulates like deer and even smaller mammals like prairie dogs or beaver or marmots. So they have a lot of options here in Colorado. We are also this kind of missing link in wolf connectivity and wolf populations from Mexico all the way up to the Arctic. And so if you look at a map of the Western US, we're kind of just this missing little puzzle piece that we think is going to be really important for both the genetic resilience and long-term recovery of wolves nationwide. And even though we have wolves directly to the north there in Wyoming, it's really, really hard for wolves to come down and disperse on their own because that state no longer has that federal protection. And so even though they're endangered in the rest of the country, in Wyoming, wolves are considered a predatory animal in 85% of the state. So it is legal to hunt and kill them pretty much by any means, any time of the year. And so it's a really difficult social landscape for them to cross over down into Colorado. There have been a couple individuals that have come on their own, and we'll talk about those a little bit. But ultimately, over the past 25 years or so, there's been around 15 to 20 individuals that have dispersed into Colorado on their own. And of all those individuals, there's only one that is alive and still in the state today. And on top of all of that, Colorado is uniquely suited to support a wolf reintroduction because we have a pretty good state-led legacy of carnivore restoration. Colorado Parks and Wildlife, our state wildlife agency, has reintroduced lynx successfully. We've been part of black-footed ferret reintroductions, part of swift fox reintroductions. And again, I'll touch on wolverines a little bit here at the end of the presentation. So a little bit of how we got to this point, because it did not start in 2020 when reintroducing wolves was put on our general election ballot. This conversation really can go at least as far back as the 80s, when discussions on whether to reintroduce wolves to Colorado really began. Again, we were long being considered this a really good, suitable wolf habitat. And so as they were looking at places like Yellowstone and central Idaho to reintroduce wolves, Colorado was part of that conversation as well. And twice in the 80s, the CPW commission was posed with whether or not to reintroduce wolves. I assume states have some version of a wildlife commission. In our state, this is the body that makes most of the decisions and rules and regulations around wildlife management. In our state, it is an 11-member governor-appointed board. They are term limited. It is a volunteer position, so they are not paid. But they make all of these really, really important wildlife decisions. And so twice in the 80s, they shot that decision down. And over time, we saw the Yellowstone reintroduction begin in the early 2000s and around 2004. They did put together a working group to create a management plan that would say how wolves would manage wolves if they came down on their own, but did not promote or consider wolf reintroduction in any way. And for a third time in 2016, the commission again passed a resolution opposing a formal wolf reintroduction, despite the advocacy around it, despite the science that said this was a good idea and that the public would support it. And so after that third no, a lot of wolf advocates got together and said, again, the science points to Colorado. How can we still see wolves restored here? And in our state, I'm not sure if this is a rule elsewhere, but in our statute actually says that any imperiled species reintroductions have to be approved by the General Assembly, so our state senators and representatives, which means either the path to reintroduction would have had to either come through a bill, proposed by a senator or a representative, or through a general election. And so this has never been done before. This was a trailblazing, precedent-setting effort to try and get wolves reintroduced. And the polling suggested that Coloradans would support it. And so a lot of planning kind of went into these kind of 5 years. But by early 2020, we were on street corners and grocery stores getting enough signatures to get on the November 2020 ballot. Around this same time, aside from all the other things starting to happen in the world, in early 2020, CPW confirms the presence of a wolf pack in the northwest corner of the state. And when I say corner, I mean stone's throw from Wyoming, stone's throw from Utah. They were really on the border of the state. We believe the whole pack came down together. We're not kind of sure where they came from. This was an uncollared pack. And we were kind of on the ground at the time trying to help monitor and figure out kind of what these wolves were doing and where they came from. And over the next kind of 5 months, we saw those sightings begin to decrease and decrease and decrease. And by the early summer of 2020, we presume that most of those members had died. We knew some were killed in Wyoming. Actually, it wasn't until last year that we really got more of the details as to what happened to that pack after the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service investigation officially concluded and showed that hunters from Wyoming had lured the members of this pack across the border with electronic pronghorn distress calls, so hunting calls, over the border where it was legal to hunt them. And so even when a whole pack is able to come down on their own, which is a feat in and of itself, they don't know when they're crossing these, invisible political borders. And so I think this only illustrated how important a formal reintroduction effort really was, to see that, a meaningful genetic population could be founded in Colorado in an area that was more central, that they weren't at risk of just, unintentionally crossing over to border where they weren't protected. And so by that point, we had gotten enough signatures to get on the ballot. And in November, Proposition 114 did pass. And that essentially mandated three really important things. One, that the CPW Commission had to put together a plan to reintroduce wolves west of the Continental Divide, so where all that suitable habitat is, by the end of 2023. It also mandated that CPW needed to help livestock producers minimize livestock loss or livestock conflict with wolves and compensate ranchers for any losses caused by wolves. So it worked some of those protections into there as well. And again, around the same time, wolves have awesome timing. CPW reported there was another 2 wolves kind of wandering the state, completely separate from this pack, in the northwest corner. These were 2 individual males that had came down separately, found each other and formed a little traveling pair. And they settled in the North Park Basin, which is, again, really close to the Wyoming border, but closer to kind of the middle of the state along the Continental Divide. And early in the spring, we learned that one of the colored individuals of this pair, there was a clerical error in Wyoming, and it was actually a female wolf that they thought was a male wolf. So it started to make a lot more sense. And they actually formed a breeding pair that spring and gave birth to the first litter of wolves in Colorado in 80 years. So that was a huge milestone. All wolf advocates celebrated the birth of those pups. Again, the celebration was a little short-lived. About a year and a half after they were born, all the female pups were killed in Wyoming. We have a lot less details around that situation. We're not sure if they wandered over there, if they were lured. Again, their pack territory was already really close to the border. So we're not sure of the circumstances. But that right there divided that pack in half. Around that same time is when the breeding female started to get a little bit more sparse. She was pretty old when she had that litter. It was not her first litter. I choose to believe that she died of old age in the woods, though we'll probably never know for sure. And so all that remains of the North Park pack today is the breeding male and one of the male pups. So to go a little bit farther back, so once Proposition 114 passed, CPW started by appointing 2 advisory groups. One was the technical working group, which was tasked with looking at the biological recommendations of wolf reintroduction. This was experts and wolf biologists from around the country to put together some recommendations for more the logistic side of the reintroduction. And they also put together a stakeholder advisory group. And so these were stakeholder representatives from around the state. Defenders was one of the people on this advisory group. There was also other environmentalists, recreationalists, hunters, ranchers, outfitters, all represented to look at the more social implications and recommendations around wolf reintroduction. And so those two groups met separately for 18 months to put together their recommendations that they submitted October of 2022. A couple months later, CPW put forward their first draft, and that kickstarted a pretty long public input process. They held a bunch of meetings around the state to give people an opportunity to voice their input around the management plan. And then that was unanimously finalized in May of 2023. So about 2.5 years in, we have a plan. Now they just need wolves. So happening on top of that whole state process is also a federal process happening. Because wolves are still endangered federally, they were designated a non-essential experimental population. I'm not sure if this has been mentioned earlier in the day, but this is pretty common with other endangered species reintroductions. And has been done with every other wolf reintroduction to date. And so by December of 2023, we had those state regulations in place, we had the federal regulations in place, and we have a December 31st deadline. And so within the couple weeks between the federal regulations being approved and the wolves being released, there was also two kind of last-ditch effort lawsuits by some ranching interest groups to try to halt or delay the reintroduction. Defenders was really critical in helping challenge and intervene on both of those cases, both of which were unsuccessful in trying to delay the reintroduction. Resumed as planned. CPW went up, sent I think about 10 staff up to Oregon last December, and they were really successful in capturing the first 10 wolves that were all released before the end of the year. And so to go a little bit into what is in that management plan that took 3 years to develop, a lot of it is based around this idea of impact-based management. And so essentially managing for the conflicts, not the number of individuals, which we felt was really important with a species like wolves that does have some of that self-population regulation. And so we advocated for that pretty heavily. They have a plan to reintroduce 10 to 15 wolves every winter for the next 3 to 5 years. This will be going on year 2. So they're going for a total of 30 to 50 individuals from ideally the northern Rockies, because they have the most kind of similar habitat in prey base that we have here in Colorado. They will be on the state endangered species list until there are 50 wolves in the state for 4 years, and then downlisted to threatened, and then delisted to non-game again on the state list after there are 150 in the state for 2 years, and they can't be delisted until the state does a population viability analysis. So this is a biological kind of modeling exercise that they use to ensure that they aren't at risk of regional extinction again if they are delisted. The plan also outlines a compensation program for producers that experiences losses to wolves and a conflict minimization program that outlines how ranchers can engage with the agency to help proactively mitigate conflict before it starts. And on the right here, you'll see a zones that they outlined. So all of the release locations are at least 60 miles from any state or tribal border. And this is to try to keep them within Colorado. Again, so they don't venture kind of up into Wyoming or into another state. We want to keep them in Colorado where they can help kind of grow this statewide population. So they have this kind of northern zone and this southern zone. Right here, kind of through this green circle is the I-70 corridor. And so if you've ever been to Colorado and like gone skiing, that's kind of this middle I-70 corridor here. The most recent reintroduction was kind of at this kind of northern part of this green line up here. Rocky Mountain National Park is kind of up in this corner of the screen. The upcoming reintroduction this year is probably going to be in this northern zone again, though I'm not sure we have a specific spot picked out yet. This plays, here we go. In case no one has seen the release footage, it's pretty cool to see. And so again, CPW staff went up to Oregon to help Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife identify and capture individuals that they'd bring down to the state. All of these wolves received a health check a new GPS collar before they were put on a helicopter and flown down to Colorado. They were all released on state-owned lands. None of them were released on any federal lands. And as you'll see here, this is called a hard release. So they're let right out of the kennel, as opposed to a soft release that would have them in a certain acclimation area for a period of time. Both methods were tried during the Yellowstone reintroduction, and there wasn't a huge difference in success rate or survival rate. So they went with this hard release method that is more cost effective and it's safer for the wolves. Keep going. Here we go. All right, so we covered all that. So what's happened this year since the releases began? We've had some highs and lows. It's been a wild year. I'm going to start with the good news. We've had a lot of really awesome accomplishments and kind of early wins this year. Colorado Parks and Wildlife has really stepped up in helping organize some of the proactive conflict prevention projects on the ground. It's been such a joy to be part of those, and watching the collaborations that have formed has been really awesome. And seeing how each agency is kind of niched down into certain different methods that they've chosen to specialize in. So CPW is leading on kind of the deterrence, like turboflaggery is a type of electrified temporary electric fencing with flags that are specific for wolf deterrence. All of the producers that have participated in that program this year did not have any losses while it was in place. So that's a really awesome accomplishment. Our Colorado Department of Agriculture has also stepped up quite a bit. They are specializing in that range riding aspect and also helping reduce carcasses that are on the kind of open range that producers have out there. Between CPW and Colorado Department of Ag, I think they've created 9 new positions to help with wolf livestock conflict. We also have a wildlife services non-lethal initiative positions here in Colorado, and they have a livestock guardian dog program. So they are helping provide Kangol puppies to any producers who are interested in livestock guardian dogs. And during the planning process, there was a bill passed in the General Assembly that hunting and fishing dollars could not be used for any part of the wolf restoration project. And wolf advocates really responded to fill that gap. And so another wolf advocate organization developed the wolf license plate. This is a specialty license plate that you can get at the DMV for your car. Has a really beautiful wolf on it. It's called the Born to Be Wild plate. It went up this January, and since then has already raised over $500,000 for CPW's conflict minimization programs, where all the profits go, or most of the profits. And I think it's projected to do $700,000 total by the end of the year. And it's that kind of sustained renewal funding that's going to make this funding source sustainable going forward. Colorado State University has also created the Conflict Reduction Fund. This is another opportunity for folks who voted for Prop 114, who live on the Front Range, who want to contribute to wolf coexistence on the ground, to help pool money together for ranchers to be able to fund some of these projects and efforts. All in all, there are 11 assistance programs throughout the state between agencies and nonprofit organizations that will help ranchers access, fund, and implement these different ways to minimize wolf livestock conflict. So the resources, the funding, the help is really there. And what's cool is we're all really working together when a project kind of comes up. We all kind of help with the labor and the maintenance of that tool. And so seeing kind of the networks and the collaboratives that have formed already is really one of the biggest things that gives me hope that this project is, ultimately going to be a success. And I can't emphasize enough how important those collaborations are in forming early on to help just kind of carry the load. Many hands make light work is what we like to say. Biologically, a huge accomplishment that we've seen is we've already seen that reproductive success. And so 2 individuals from the reintroduction formed a breeding pair in Grand County, and had the reintroduction. So they had 5 pups, and this made the Copper Creek wolf pack. And with all those accomplishments does come some challenges. We've had 26 confirmed livestock losses this year, which is a fraction of the amount of livestock total in the state, of the amount of livestock just lost to all reasons within the state. But around half of those losses all occurred on one property. And it was that operation and that situation that led to CPW deciding to capture and relocate that Copper Creek pack. So our only actual reproductive wolf pack in the state was captured this August, which was a tough development to hear. Soon after that pack was captured, the breeding male did die due to injuries that he sustained prior to the capture effort. Once they got him, he was pretty underweight, I think 30% underweight from when they released him. And he had a pretty severe infection in one of his legs. And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is currently doing an investigation and necropsy into how he sustained those injuries. We should have those results any day. So we're watching that situation pretty closely. Soon after we got the news of his death, there was another lone male that had died, also in Grand County. And so we're awaiting the results of that investigation as well. And then there's a third individual that died in April due to mountain lion conflict. And so 3 of the released wolves have died since their release in December, which is unfortunate to hear. And it's really those kind of 3 kind of stories that have really dominated the media in a really negative way. And so that's been one of our biggest challenges this year is how do we change the public conversation to something that's more positive and just more constructive? How do we have a lot of these conversations in front of each other rather than letting it play out in the media or at commission meetings? And so now what? So as of right now, full steam ahead. CPW is planning to capture 15 more wolves this upcoming winter. December through March is kind of the ideal capture season for wolves. And these ones will come down from British Columbia. There is currently a petition being put forth to the commission to halt or delay the releases. This was a petition for rulemaking by some of the stock grower associations. And so if anyone lives in Colorado and is looking to help with some of the advocacy front, please reach out to me and I will help you with talking points. We're trying to get as many people as possible to contact the commission and tell them that they still support the ongoing wolf reintroduction. And then we get a lot of questions about kind of where the wolves are and kind of what they're doing. And most states don't share kind of direct collar data, and neither does Colorado Parks and Wildlife. The GPS collars are a really useful kind of biological tool. I don't think they're as useful of a conflict prevention tool as folks think. So the collars collect data every 4 hours. So they get kind of a single point, kind of where that wolf is every 4 hours. And then that's packaged up and delivered every 16 hours to CPW. So they can see where they were, but they can't see where they are, like an Apple Watch. And they can't see where they're going. But to give folks kind of some semblance of kind of where they're moving and where they're branching out to, and still until we start kind of to see some of localized pack territories, they've been publishing a wolf activity map that shows watershed at the watershed scale, where wolves have ventured out to. And so we've taken that data and pulled that together to kind of see over time where wolves are going. So these kind of black boundary lines, these are watersheds. This kind of big green portion is that ideal kind of suitable habitat. This kind of center part you can tell is where they were released. So they're kind of fraying out from there. Up in this upper part is that North Park pack. So that's that activity you see up here. You'll see this part kind of goes towards Fort Collins, which is a pretty densely populated area. Keeps moving. Pretty densely populated area. This is around the time that that individual was killed by that mountain lion and around the location that it was. So I think this was just one individual that tried to go a little bit east and ultimately died out this way. Around here is where the Copper Creek pack was located. And then we have a couple other kind of groups of wolves kind of mixing pairs every so often and trying to figure out who they want to travel with and where they ultimately want to settle down. And so having more wolves come down this winter will be even more helpful in trying to form more of those breeding packs that will help us grow that population faster. So what about Wolverines? I've been teasing this all day. So if you've never heard of a Wolverine before, you are in good company. Hugh Jackman, who played Marvel's Wolverine, did not know they existed until after they started filming. Most folks I talk to think this is like a mythological creature or just a comic book character. And they are a real critter. And so they're actually mustelids. So they're part of the weasel family. So think a badger-like body, very pancake-shaped, short, fluffy, stocky, muscular, built for some really rugged habitat. So they're about a foot tall, about 3 feet wide, and they're built for the high snowy alpine. These guys are what I would consider a more habitat specialist. They like really high elevation, very snowy, cold environments. They like that backcountry habitat that most people are not brave enough to go. I'm one of those people that is not brave enough to go in some of those very remote areas. After decades and decades of advocacy, they were finally listed as federally threatened last year, which will bring a lot more attention, funding, and opportunity to helping see this species restored in a meaningful way. There's probably less than 300 individuals in the lower 48, or 350 individuals in the lower 48. They're really solitary and elusive, so it's hard to get firm population counts on them. And there's a lot of research opportunity to still learn more about them. But even in healthy populations, wolverines are very naturally rare because of that solitary behavior. And that snowy kind of backcountry habitat that they require is at large threat due to climate change. And so where their current kind of habitat is right now, think Montana, Idaho, and kind of up in the Cascades, is projected, and down here in Colorado is projected to fare better for climate change than that current habitat because our mountains are at higher elevation. So Colorado has a huge opportunity to provide this kind of climate refuge for wolverines. And they have really low potential for human-wildlife conflict because they're mostly scavengers. They're very well adapted for scavenging in the winter. In the summer, they may prey on marmots and other small mammals, though they're thought to be, very ferocious and can take down a moose. They can take down a moose. We've heard a lot of stories from states like Alaska that have more wolverines, but in general, they try to avoid those kinds of conflicts with both animals that are much bigger than them, but also people. So this spring, again, because reintroductions need to be approved by our General Assembly, a bipartisan pair of sponsors led this effort to pass a bill to give CPW the authority to reintroduce wolverines to the state. And this is really a continuation of a prior effort. So back in the 90s, when CPW started to plan for the lynx reintroduction, they wanted to do wolverines at the same time. And ultimately, once it kind of got closer, lynx was a lot already on their plate, and they were also hoping for this Endangered Species Act listing. And so they decided to focus on lynx and then return to wolverines once they were listed. And so now that they're listed, they've immediately, stuck to that promise and renewed that effort. And so that bill passed with flying colors this spring. There was not only support from wildlife advocates like Defenders of Wildlife, but also hunting groups, ski industry. And so it was really not only a bipartisan effort, but with stakeholders at large, there was very little opposition to wolverine reintroduction, which is not something I take for granted, and it's just something really exciting to be a part of. So we expect that management plan to come out probably before the end of the year. So again, as another great opportunity for advocacy, if you're interested, be sure to sign up for Defenders Action Alerts on our website, and we'll send you kind of location-specific opportunities for your area. So whether you are a young person kind of breaking into this space or a professional working on different reintroductions, some of the things that I would really recommend focusing on, just being part of these two programs, to give a few would be, encourage really abundant agency communication. And I mean this both directions. So we hear all the time from decision makers and commissioners and legislators that they don't hear enough from wildlife advocates, or they only hear from us when it's, a critical kind of boiling over point. And so encouraging kind of that more steady and consistent communication along the way, maybe on the smaller things or just to say positive things. A lot of these people do not hear a lot of positivity from any direction. And so encouraging that as much as possible, I think, is really important. It also just helps kind of build that trust and credibility. And coming the other direction as well. And so that's probably one of the biggest criticisms that CPW has had this year with the wolf reintroduction is their level or method of communication or transparency. And so I think that's really important, whether or not it's like a high profile species or not. But also making sure that you're communicating in a way that your audience is really going to reach. So is it only through press releases? Is it only in the newspaper? Are you using social media? Are you not? And that to my next point of social media. I think something that has made the Colorado wolf reintroduction so different is it is the first one in the age of social media. And I think a lot of people underestimated what an impact that was going to make. And so have a plan, both defensive and offensive. I think a lot of this year we've been on the defensive for social media, and a lot of the poking of fires and the spreading of misinformation has all really played out in the comment section, and that can be a really hard thing to mitigate. And so have a plan how you're going to combat some of that misinformation, some of those negative messages. But also how can you use that kind of power of social media for good, right? And so again, if you are kind of breaking into this space, I always want to emphasize, like, you do not need to be a biologist or a statistician to make a huge impact in wildlife conservation. I think the folks that really know visual storytelling and social media and marketing are some of the most powerful people in wildlife conservation right now. So don't sleep on those soft skills and some of those more newer kind of strategies to reaching different audiences, because it's really been important here. And kind of along that vein, really dig into the social science. I think especially in wildlife biology, it's said a lot, what does social science have to do with wildlife biology? And we're really learning the importance of it. And it's one of the first lessons that I learned getting my degree in wildlife conservation is, conservation issues are human issues, really first. And so those social science pieces are so important to not only doing better outreach and performing better advocacy, but really learning kind of the heart of the issues at hand. And especially with wolves, I think we see that it's not about the animals themselves at all. It's about some of these bigger social issues of, the future of the American West, of the future of ranching, of the future of wildlife conservation. And what does this piece or that piece signal to kind of that bigger picture is really the issue that we're looking at. And so really dig into that social science, and whatever you can do to help kind of advance that field, I think is the kind of next frontier that's really exciting to be a part of. And I mentioned earlier, but focusing on that community building, collaboration building, that trust building as early as possible makes a lot of this a lot easier once paws are on the ground. Or whatever your species may be. I think that's really been where we've seen all the progress that we've had so far is due to a lot of these different collaborations, and working with people that may have really different backgrounds and opinions than your own. I think in my case, those people have made me so much better at my job. And again, better at learning at exactly what is the problem and where the differences lie. Because when you kind of get into these conversations in a place with shared respect and shared trust, we've learned that, we have a lot more common ground and similarities than we have differences. And so can we find those similarities and areas of common ground and build up from there? And so in the case of wolves, this coexistence piece, helping ranchers mitigate conflict and minimize conflict on the ground, has been a really important area of common ground. Because whether you are a rancher trying to protect your livestock or a wolf advocate trying to protect wolves, you're there for the same thing, the same goal. And why you got there doesn't quite matter as much as the fact that you are working towards that shared goal and having those kind of concrete tasks to accomplish together. gives you more confidence that you can kind of tackle the harder thing and then the harder thing and the harder thing next. And with that, that is all I got. So I will leave my email there too. We have a little bit of time for questions. But if more questions come up afterwards, please feel free to take down my email and reach out later.
Super. Thanks, Katie. That was a lot of information to share, and you did it very well.
Thank you. It's a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. I've got some questions for you. Let's see. What does long-term coexistence between wolves and humans in Colorado look like, and how will the state work to foster positive human-wolf relationships?
That's a great question. So I think when we look at what does coexistence look like, not only in Colorado, but I think anywhere, to me, what that really means is using those collaborations and some of those innovative ideas or traditional ideas to minimize that conflict between wolves and livestock. And sometimes that doesn't really necessarily mean the animals themselves, like I was saying earlier, but more that social conflict that we see. And so encouraging as much of those conversations face to face, and again, as early on as possible. We've seen that, most of the people that I talk to are actually not opposed to wolves. It's just, what does this mean for me and my operation is where the concern comes. And sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's, again, legacy. What does this mean for my future? And so getting to the root for each individual person of where does the concern lie, and then trying to tackle the problem from there once you actually know what the concern is a lot easier. And again, I think we have a lot of resources already available as far as actually getting tools and programs on the ground to help minimize that conflict. And so I think we've already started pretty well on seeing that just continue and ride from there. But I think, the long-term longevity for coexistence in Colorado really revolves around changing kind of that social tone towards a conversation that's a bit more productive. Yeah.
Nice. I've got another one for you. What are the expected ecological benefits of wolf reintroduction in Colorado, particularly in relation to restoring balance in predator-prey dynamics?
That's another great question. So again, we have a lot of elk. Some of those areas are really overpopulated with elk, and we've seen the impacts of that on a lot of our native plant species, even in areas like Rocky Mountain National Park. And so we're hoping with the return of wolves and to see some of these ecological benefits, we really need that sustainable, healthy population of wolves. But I think once we get to that point, we're really hoping to see having elk on the move again so that they're not settling in these areas for too long, help that native vegetation kind of replenish a little bit, and seeing kind of the impacts it can make to a lot of our public lands will be really exciting to see. We've also seen coyote populations boom since the extirpation of wolves, and so we'll also probably see these mesocarnivores start to shift around in population and abundance as wolves are restored to the state.
Great. We have someone who commented that their husband saw a Wolverine 2 separate times in the last 2 years in southern Idaho. Super cool.
Lucky man. Lucky man.
Yeah, I thought that was funny that Hugh Jackman, who played Wolverine, didn't even know that that was a real thing.
He prepared by studying wolves for like several weeks and then got on set and he was like, okay, I learned all this stuff about wolves. And they're like, why? You're playing a Wolverine. So I think that's just hilarious. We've been trying to get him to be a spokesman for Wolverine restoration. So if anyone's got connections to Hugh Jackman, please let me know.
Yes, I would also just love to meet him.
Right?
All right, we've got another question for you. Sarah says, sorry if you spoke to this already, but what does collaboration look like with neighboring state agencies and tribal governments? Great question.
Yeah, great question. Absolutely. So we have seen a lot of interagency collaboration as far as training CPW staff. They've done training with folks in Wyoming. They were recently just up there in Oregon and Idaho for training for a couple weeks, looking at different kind of emerging tools like drones to use for conflict reduction. I think they were hoping to do more depredation training, and then there just weren't any depredations. So what are you going to do? But we've seen a lot of that interagency communication around kind of wolf knowledge, which is really awesome to see. As far as the tribal piece, this has been in a lot of the headlines as well in recent months. If anyone heard, the Colville Reservation in Washington was originally going to supply wolves for this winter. And then they backed out of the agreement after getting a letter from the Southern Ute tribe, which is here in Colorado, asking them to not provide wolves. And so the Ute, Mountain Ute, and the Southern Ute have been opposed to the wolf reintroduction. They are concerned about the populations of their elk in their treaty area where they're able to hunt elk is their main concern, as well as impacts on livestock operations there. And so there have been efforts to try to, provide trainings and outreach. I'm not sure the extent of what CPW has, the conversations and things that they've had to try to engage with the tribes here in Colorado. There was, on top of that, those advisory groups that were done in 2021. There was an agency or tribal engagement done at that same time by the facilitator of the planning process, which was Keystone Policy Center. So they technically fulfilled their obligation, but I think the commitment and kind of continuation of that commitment has been kind of called into question. But again, I can't kind of speak to what has happened kind of behind closed doors that we're not privy to. So I do think that is an area for improvement going forward.
Thank you for that. Let's see. Michael says, I spend a lot of time in France where wolf predation has become a big issue. Are you and Defenders coordinating at all with equivalent French conservation groups?
We've talked to folks in Europe. I know that's where a lot of research has happened, but I don't know any of the kind of agency or nonprofit equivalent. So I'd love to learn more if you know any of the groups that are kind of working out there. It is my understanding that a big difference between kind of the state of wolves and wolf conflict in Europe is different from the kind of American West, just because the abundance of our public lands and in the available prey is largely what I think that's come down to. But I'd love to hear more about kind of the different solutions that folks have come up with there and the different barriers that they've seen. So yeah, thanks for saying that.
We have time for a couple more. How might climate change impact the success of wolf reintroduction, particularly in terms of habitat availability and prey populations?
So I think just because of how resilient and adaptable wolves are in such a wide different variety of habitats, I'm not as worried about climate change impacting them as much as species like wolverines and some of these other animals that are really sensitive to those changes in snowpack and changes in temperature. But absolutely, it's going to change how the ungulates migrate, and that's ultimately what's going to dictate where wolves are going to have suitable habitat going forward. And that just may very well shift as our climate changes. But I think looking at things like population density is probably a more probably could direct more impact or draw more impact just because of how it is fragmenting their habitat is what we're kind of already seeing happen before our eyes.
Okay, maybe you can answer this. What measures are being taken to monitor the health of reintroduced wolves to prevent the spread of diseases like mange or canine distemper?
So when those wolves were selected at their capture site, so I mentioned they got a health check. So they checked, teeth, bones, all of that kind of stuff to make sure that the individuals that they were bringing down were healthy. They also got different kinds of shots and tests for things like distemper. So they have been treated for those types of diseases. I think, this far, the biggest concern has just really been injury is kind of what we've ran into rather than actual disease. But I know that's something that the biologists are monitoring. And as they kind of go on capturing individuals in the state for collaring efforts, they're able to conduct a lot of those kind of blood tests as well. But so far we have not had any issue with wolves transmitting or disease to humans or other canines or even to each other.
Great. Does anyone have any more questions for Katie? You've got several comments of appreciation for your passion and your motivation for the work that you're doing with defenders. So a round of applause for you.
You guys.
If we don't have any more questions, oh, there's one. Let's see. Great point about managers and decision makers needing to hear from all voices, not just the folks with concerns, but also advocates. It feels like the people with concerns get a disproportionate amount of attention. Any thoughts on how we can make more space for the benefits from species conservation?
This is another great point, and I think it's something that wolf advocates have really struggled with. I think this year is that we are constantly kind of butting up against these concerns and the challenges instead of being able to really talk about that huge list of accomplishments that I shared is so much longer than that list of challenges, and yet that's really all we've been able to talk about. And it feels like CPW really hasn't been able to celebrate and be proud on their own of what they've already been able to accomplish, which is got to be sad. And this is already very emotionally hard work. Wolves are one of the hardest species to work on, one of the most emotionally charged species to work on. And so making that space for that positivity is, I think, something that more and more people are finally starting to talk about. I held a panel earlier this spring at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, and it had myself as a nonprofit representative. There was a rancher, CPW's wolf coordinator, and a social science researcher. And so completely different backgrounds, completely different kind of mindsets when it comes to wolves. And we were talking about kind of where is that common ground. And throughout the conversation, and I feel like panels are typically designed to kind of show where the differences are. And really what we found is that we agreed on just about everything. And I think it gave not only the panelists a lot of hope, but the audience a lot of hope as far as like, oh, like this is not all doom and gloom. There is a lot of opportunity here. And it's just, I think, again, largely, the media and social media kind of pushing a lot of these negative headlines. And so it really comes back to community building, and either in your kind of small, your personal space, your friends and family, kind of your network. How do I encourage more of this positive information about wolves? And then kind of spreading to your community, to the commission, to decision makers, to show that, Coloradans do still support wolf restoration. And I think the West at large, as we look at what does national recovery look like, focusing on all those benefits that wolves bring, not only to our ecosystems, but to our communities as well.
Beautiful. I think that was a great way to conclude your presentation.
Drop an email in the chat again if anyone has questions that come up later. If you'd like to connect, feel free to reach out to me. But thank you guys.
Great. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.